Okay. Bom dia, caros participantes, dear participants. It is with great honor and satisfaction that ANAC, as the organizer of this initiative, notes your receptiveness to our invitation to participate in this workshop on environment capacity building, which is quite an important topic. So I would like to welcome you all, and I'm speaking English to all Portuguese people because we are also recording, and we hope to reach out to several other countries also. So I would like to welcome you all, in particular the representative of the European and European and North Atlantic Regional Office of ICAO, or NAT, Mrs. Blandine Ferrier, and the representative of the European Civil Aviation Conference, ECAC, Mr. César Velarde. Thank you for coming, for the important support in this capacity building session, as well as also our esteemed colleagues from the Portuguese Environment Agency that will be part remotely. Air transport industry plays a fundamental role in the worldwide economy, as we all know, linking people and regions, contributing for the economic prosperity, as well to social and cultural development. Sustainability is crucial to achieve all these results. That's why we are here. During the last decades, significant progress has been made in the civil aviation sector on operational, technological, air traffic management, and sustainable alternative fuels, SAF. However, global warming persists, unfortunately, a reality. The opportunity of this work results, among others, from the need to approach you, our stakeholders, and all those with interests in aviation and environment rules, to share some thoughts on topics such as challenges on CORSIA implementation, new provisions for EU ETS for aviation, the state of art of the long-term aspirational goal for aviation, LTAG, the importance of action plans for ICAO. Regarding CORSIA, the objective is to further explain to participants the requirements, procedures, necessary actions, and related responsibilities involved in the CORSIA implementation. The new provisions proposed under the Fit for 55 package on EU ETS for aviation will, of course, also be an important part of the program. So the aim is to agree on a long-term aspiration goal for international civil aviation CO2 emissions reduction and make it a reality. And the conclusions of the ICAO high-level meeting last week in Montreal were quite inspiring for that, to all of our civil aviation community. So we need to stress the need to agree on the next ICAO assembly on a common goal, as the promotion of sustainability is absolutely paramount. State action plans have an important role in this process. They should outline actions and roadmaps, including long-term projections, and highlight national capacities and circumstances, as well as any specific assistance needs for the implementation of CO2 reduction measures. So, dear participants, meus caros participantes, todos portugueses aqui, nós aqui a falar em inglês, porque os nossos convidados também vão falar inglês. ANAC is fully committed to contribute to address all of these concerns, supporting the efforts made by the national and international organizations and stakeholders. Finally, I would like to point out that international cooperation represents an important commitment for us. This is the proof of that, so thank you again. Portugal, through its Civil Aviation Authority, ANAC, is engaged in strengthening the cooperation with ICAO and its member states, and in particular, with the Portuguese-speaking countries, having in mind the language affinity. Caros colegas da CACL, cá estamos também para vos apoiar e para receber os vossos contributos e aprender convosco nesta matéria. So, wishing you all a profitable workshop. Desejo a todos uma excelente jornada de trabalho e cá estarei eu também para aprender nesta matéria. Bom dia a todos.
Thank you. Is that working? Yeah? Okay. Well, thank you. On behalf of ICAO, I would like to thank ANAC for organizing this event. We are very pleased to be with you today and to discuss, because I don't think it's going to be only about sharing knowledge. I think it's going to be about discussion. It's going to be about capacity building. So we are very happy to be part of it and to work together with ANAC Portugal on environment. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Bom dia, todos, todas. Muito obrigado. Thank you very much also to ANAC for this invitation It's a pleasure for ECAC to be here as well, working together with ICAO. And clearly we will see today that environment will be taking a key role in the next assembly discussions, and we will be happy to share what is coming with you, and also happy to address your questions. Eu gostaria muito poder fazer as apresentações em português, mas vamos fazer em inglês. Eu falarei portunhol se precisa. Tá? Muito obrigado, então.
I think that we can begin, Cesar and Blandine. So we invite you to share your expertise with all of us regarding the recent developments and the future of aviation and climate change. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I will be the one starting, since we are going to talk about, for the global picture, let's talk about ICAO and what ICAO is doing on environment. So I'm sorry, my portugnol is very limited, so it's going to be English for me. So as you may know, I don't know if you're familiar with ICAO, but ICAO has a mission. And the mission of ICAO is to serve as a global forum for state to discuss about international aviation matters. And as you can see on the slide in front of you, you see the 5 strategic objectives of ICAO on safety, capacity and efficiency, security facilitation, economic development, and environmental protection. So environmental protection is one of the strategic objectives of ICAO. And when we serve our mission, I would say, we are the global forum to discuss about environmental protection. And that was highlighted by Tanya in her opening remarks when she was talking about the high-level meeting on the long-term aspirational goals event that happened last week in Montreal, where 193 states, our member states, were invited to discuss on this strategy. The vision of ICAO is to achieve the sustainable growth of the global aviation system. And I think we have to keep that in mind when we are talking about environment and aviation. So we are going to go in more detail. I'm sorry, I'm stuck in my... Yes, it's a bit sticky. So let's talk about environment and what ICAO does in terms of environment. So we have 3 environmental goals that you see on the screen, and the one we are going to talk a little bit in more detail today, it's about our goal on limiting or reducing the impact of aviation greenhouse gas emission on global climate. And this is linked, you will see, with the strategic objective. Okay? That you can see on the screen is when we started to work on environment and climate change, when the assembly, and when I talk about the assembly, I'm talking about the 193 states of ICAO who decided on 2 global aspirational goals. This, as you see the screen, yeah, right. The first one is to have 2% annual fuel efficiency improvement through 2050, and the second one was to achieve carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards. With these 2 goals in mind, and you can see on the left-hand side of the screen a graph that shows how to reach those goals. And you see that we have 4 different, we call them category of measures. They are part of the basket of measures, and we will see that in detail when we will be talking about State Action Plan, this basket of measures. This has been developed by ICAO in 2010, and this basket of measures composed of 4 categories of measures: aircraft technology, that you see in the blue line on the graph, operational improvement in orange, and in green, you have sustainable aviation fuel and CORSIA. And with these 4 categories of measures that are part of the basket of measures, the objective is to reach carbon neutral growth from 2020. That is one of the goals that's been set by the Assembly in 2010. So in 2016, when I say we, it's we, ICAO, and our member state, we realized that we were not going to be able to achieve this carbon neutral growth from 2020 only with technology improvement and sustainable aviation fuel, and that's why CORSIA came into play. And CORSIA was agreed and approved by the Assembly in 2016. Then in 2019, last Assembly, we have been requested, ICAO Secretariat, been requested by the state to work on exploring the feasibility of a long-term aspirational goal for international aviation. And this to be proposed at the Assembly, that's going to start in September this year, to consider the work done on the feasibility of this long-term aspirational goal and to decide if we want to have this kind of goal for the long term. So what you see on the screen is really what happened since 2010 with the two medium-term goals, 2% annual fuel efficiency improvement through 2050, carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards, and now what we are going to ask our states, our member states, is to decide if yes or no you want to have a long-term aspirational goals for aviation. And this is crucial. So I think if there is one key message from the meeting today, that's the long-term aspirational goal. Is there a question? Sorry. Nope. Okay. So I've been talking about the basket of measure, and what you see on the screen is this basket of measure with the 4 categories of measure: aircraft technology, operational improvement, sustainable aviation fuel, and CORSIA. What you see is just some of the progress that have been achieved on these 4 categories of measures with, if I take aircraft technology, for example, the global CO2 certification standard that has been approved in 2017. We have on aircraft technology all this new material, the hybrid electric aircraft, renewable energy sources. So all these measures are related to aircraft technology. And you will remember the graph that showed the kind of benefits, and when I talk about benefits, it's CO2 emission reduction, right? That's clear for everybody? That's the slide before. What you see on the blue line is in blue on the graph, it's the kind of benefits, CO2 emission reduction, that we can achieve with this kind of mitigation measure. That's clear? And I don't speak too fast, right? Okay, perfect. Operational improvement. So this is the kind of mitigation measure that we have from air traffic management, air navigation system, green airport, and so on. Sustainable aviation fuel. I won't go into much detail because we will have a specific presentation this afternoon on SAF. But what you can see on the screen now is we have now 9 conversion processes that have been approved. We have 53 airports that distribute SAF worldwide, 24 states that have developed or in the process of developing policies to support SAF deployment and development. There are more than 27 billion liters of SAF that are now under offtake agreement. So this is to show that SAF has been progressing a lot. You will see in the LTAG discussion that SAF is crucial, very important element, and we will have this afternoon a dedicated presentation on SAF. And then CORSIA, that's the last part of the basket of measure. So CORSIA, that stands for Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And what I want to say here is we have now 115 states that have announced their voluntary participation in CORSIA for 2023. So CORSIA is also going and progressing in the right direction. So I've been talking about LTAG, and we will talk about LTAG a little bit more here. So at the last assembly in 2019, the resolution 4018, paragraph 9, requested ICAO to work on the LTAG work. And what has been requested is to explore the feasibility of a long-term aspirational goal for international aviation through conducting detailed studies assessing the attainability, impact of any goal proposed, including the impact on growth as well as cost, and this is very important on the LTAG work, for all countries, especially developing countries. This is to be ready for the upcoming assembly, that's going to be in September 2022, and where member states will decide if they want to approve this long-term aspirational goals. So the LTAG report is available on the ICAO website. It has been developed with the support of CAPE. CAPE is the Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection. It's a committee composed of experts. There are more than 600 experts that have been nominated by state to work on CAPE. So it's a very, I would say, complete and inclusive a system where states nominate experts to work on specific subject. And experts from CAPE have been nominated to work on the long-term aspirational goals. So what CAPE has been doing, and not the 600 people have been working on the CAPE, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, around 200 experts have been involved in the process. And what CAPE did is first to do this data gathering from internal and external sources to understand where we could get benefits. And when I talk about benefits, it's CO2 emission reduction. They developed in combined scenarios, so there are 3 scenarios that have been developed in this report. And they conducted a final analysis to understand the impact on CO2 emission, estimate the costs associated with the 3 scenarios that they developed. And this was in the context of the latest scientific knowledge. And this report, as I said, is available on the ICAO public website in 6 languages. So I'm not going in detail on this one. This is to give this, you will have the presentation obviously, but this is to tell you what kind of questions have been addressed when they were developing the report. For the sake of time, I'm just passing it. So we are now in 2022. The high-level meeting took place. Next element for the high-level, for the LTAG discussion is going to be the council. So we will have a council meeting at the end of August, and then it's going to present the LTAG report, and the discussion of the high-level meeting will be presented at the 31st Assembly for the discussion by the member state. So this, as mentioned by Tanya, we had this high-level meeting last week. We had more than 199 countries that met in Montreal or virtually to discuss about this LTAG report. What is important to highlight is, I think what I want to highlight here is that we do have an agreement on a summary of discussion. We have all the states that were part in this meeting that agreed on working toward this direction, and this is going to pave the discussion for the Council and the Assembly. So I think it, according to me, it's a very positive outcome, and it's good to have this 199 states working toward the same direction. So I think my colleague will provide more this kind of European view on the LTAG discussion, but from a global point of view, it's a very positive outcome.
Thank you. You will see today that we will be switching between Blandine and myself because we have decided to combine our material to present together. Just important also to clarify, I represent the European Civil Aviation Conference that it's working to support the European states on contributing to the ICAO global achievements and the ICAO agreements. So we close together with different scope. ICAO is global. My organization coordinates European views. So I will just briefly comment on which are the European priorities on this regard for the next assembly. But first, I think maybe part of our audience might not be really familiar with what we are talking about, the concept of long-term aspirational goal. Maybe just to clarify that what we are talking, the objective for the next assembly, that is just in 1 month, 2 months from now, it's a real revolution for the aviation world. So the objective is to establish a decarbonization pathway in the long term. We have not established yet a date, but just to give a reference, the international aviation industry through IATA, Airports Council International Manufacturers, have agreed on a decarbonization pathway to 2050 and has established the objective of net zero emissions of the global aviation system by 2050. That is a super challenging, that means decarbonizing aviation in the next 30 years. That is a really a revolution in terms of technology, in terms of operations, in terms of fuels mainly. So just to transmit the idea that this is not just an environmental topic, the decisions on the assembly, if those are ambitious, as we expect from Europe. That's why I'm commenting the European ambition is really to have an ambitious goal in line with the industry, that net zero the net zero objective by 2050. That it's a real revolution on how aviation will be in the next 30 years. Just to transmit that key message to all of you. So from the European point of view, we are presenting two main European papers addressing long-term aspirational goals. The first is called Perspectives on Sustainable Aviation, including a long-term aspirational goal for international aviation. And the second is about financing the implementation of those ambition goals. So one of the main challenges of establishing such a goal is that there will be need a huge investment on new technologies, on developing a new sustainable aviation fuels to replace the fossil current kerosene. So that needs a lot of mobilization of resources. There is an additional European paper on CORSIA, but it's a separate paper because it's CORSIA and long-term aspirational goals are two different discussions, very much linked, but are separate. I also clarify that. So on the first paper, the European vision on how to establish that a long-term aspirational goal in the next assembly, the main idea is that Europe really wants an ambition objective that would lead to in-sector CO2 emissions reductions. When we say in-sector, is that currently, for example, CORSIA, we will see in the next presentation, is offsetting the compensating the carbon emissions of the aviation. So the long-term aspirational goal, the intention of Europe and ICAO and many other member states is really to focus on decarbonizing through in-sector measures the aviation system. So the objective is that to reach an in-sector decarbonization non higher than a third of the 2019 CO2 levels in 2050. Also, it's very important for Europe to establish a strong monitoring system to follow up the progress towards those goals. And also, as I mentioned, the achievement of that ambition will require strong investments for its implementation. So it's also important for Europe to support the key role of ICAO in facilitating those investments and facilitating the connection of the financial world with the industry needs. And finally, a number of states, especially those that has a less mature aviation system, will need help and support. So capacity building will also, and funding will be also a key priority from the European perspective to be achieved in the next assembly. And that is linked with the second paper that is about financing. So again, European pushes for facilitating the access to the necessary funding as an essential tool to achieve those goals, and also enhance capacity building and promote ICAO leadership in, Blandine will talk later on the ICAO, let's say, capacity building proposals, but also ECAC is working on supporting through capacity building. We will talk about it later. So back to you, Blandine, to continue with the priorities in 2022.
Thank you. Another element that I wanted to mention is the State Action Plan initiative, and it's linked to the LTAC discussion as a mean to monitor the progress that state will also implement. And one way that is under discussion for the LTAG discussion as well. So one way to monitor this progress is also for the state, when they develop a state action plan, is to include that progress in their state action plan. So it could be one mean. So where do we stand on state action plan? I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with state action plan process. Are you? I know one person is, but I wanted to check if other people are familiar with state action plan. Okay, no. Good. So State Action Plan is an initiative that we launched at ICAO in 2010, and the idea was for the state to develop a plan where they outline their objective and actions that they want to implement to reduce CO2 emission from international aviation. So it's voluntary. Each state decides to develop it or not. States are, of course, invited to do so, but it's up to the state to decide to develop an action plan or not. But when a state decides to develop an action plan, then the state needs to comply with ICAO guidance. That means you need to have a certain format and to report certain information to ICAO. So as of today, we have now 133 states that decided to develop a state action plan, which, as you can see on the screen, is a very good result. And states have really been involved in this action. Because as you can see, 133 states, they decided to develop an action plan to showcase what they are doing with their stakeholders. So it's not only the Civil Aviation Authority, it's Civil Aviation Authority with the airlines, with the airport, with the stakeholder, the national stakeholder that developed this action plan. So it's a very strong signal when we see this kind of map. Currently, we have also 2 assistance projects with the EU funding, so EU from the European Union, where we are supporting states in the AFI region to develop their action plan. And I can tell you that now these 10 states, they do have their state action plan. So that's a very good project. So this is state action plan. Portugal has a state action plan, and Portugal has been updated its state action plan. So that means regularly Portugal provide additional information on what's happening in Portugal regarding aviation and environment. So all the activities that have been undertaken by Portugal stakeholder, when I talk about Portuguese stakeholder, I mean aviation stakeholder. So airlines, airport, Civil Aviation Authority, of course, they are the one leading the project. And then what's happening in Portugal on environment and aviation. So changing subject, we talked about sustainable aviation fuel. As I said, we will have a presentation this afternoon on SAF mainly. What I want to showcase here is this new tool that ICAO has developed. That's the SAF tracking tool. It's available on the ICAO website. I will show you that this afternoon, including a map that showcases where you can find all the facilities on alternative fuel, what's happening in different countries, and you can really see that these initiatives are worldwide. And the third element I want to show here is the ICAO Conference on Aviation, the third one that's going to be happening in 2023. So we have looking at the LTAC discussion, looking at the importance of sustainable aviation fuel for the decarbonization of aviation. This is going to be a very important conference in 2023. You want to add something? ICAO, talking about SAF, ICAO launched the SAF initiative. It's an initiative that has been launched on the 1st of June, and state and organizations were invited to explain their intention to join SAF, or their interest to join SAF. And the idea with SAF is to create partnerships and relationship between all the state and the organization, relevant stakeholder, to support the development and deployment of sustainable aviation fuel. And ICAO, the role of ICAO is to bring all the partners together to make sure that if a state would need assistance to develop sustainable aviation fuel, and I'm not talking necessarily about financial assistance, I'm talking about guidance, discussion, as you're doing actually on aviation. I have the chance some years ago to be in a meeting with Portugal, Brazil, Mozambique, and Cape Verde to discuss about environment. And this kind of interaction that you do within a group, this kind of initiatives are very interesting. This is the kind of initiative we want to recreate with ACSAF, for example. Let's move now to CORSIA. So CORSIA is the fourth component of the basket of measures. And this is just to show you the situation back in April. Sorry, I don't have the latest update. One important element is here is to see that we have a lot of states already providing data to ICAO. The data are the amount of CO2 emission generated by airlines, the list of aeroplane operator per state, and the list of accredited bodies, verification bodies that are available in your state. And all this information is reported by the state to ICAO through the CORSIA Central Registry. The next deadline, and we will talk about this next deadline, is at the end of July, so very soon we are expecting to receive the CO2 emission report from the state before the 31st July. So this is something I mentioned before. Important element now is to look at the number of states that decided to join voluntary CORSIA in the first and pilot phase. And we have now 115 states that will be part of CORSIA offsetting. This is the offsetting part. We will have a presentation on CORSIA more precisely after this one. But now we have 115 states that have decided to join the offsetting part of CORSIA for 2023. So, yeah, I'm not going in more detail on this one. The one I want to showcase here is the CORSIA Buddy Partnership. This is one of the capacity building initiatives that IQ has developed, and this one is to support states to implement CORSIA. So states that have already implemented CORSIA support states to implement the CORSIA requirement. We'll see this a little bit later. And this is the important slide. We'll go in detail after the CORSIA presentation. But just to give you some heads up, I was talking about the 31st July. This is the next deadline for the state, for Portugal, including to provide the 2021 CO2 emission data to ICAO through the CCR. Then we will see the other deadline in the next presentation. Just some heads up. And next step or ongoing step. So last week we had the ICAO stock taking event. The stock taking event is an event of ICAO where we invite representatives from various domains to showcase what's happening in terms of technology, operation, fuel. And this information is used then for the LTAG discussion. We had the LTAG meeting, so the high-level meeting on the long-term aspirational goal that was held last week. Then, where the objective was to consider the CO2 emission reduction scenarios that are listed in the LTAG report, and the means of implementation and monitoring of progress. Then, the result of the high-level meeting will be discussed at the ICAO Council. So, I don't know if you're familiar with ICAO, but we have a council, we have a governing body, it's a council. It is 36 states that are part of this council, and they are representing the 193 states of ICAO. The council meets regularly, and they provide orientation on our action. And then every 3 years, we have the assembly where all of member states decide on the next activity for the next triennium. So they agree on what has been done, and then they decide on the priorities for the next triennium. So, as I said, next deadline for us is the ICAO Council at the end of August to decide and discuss on the outcome of the high-level meeting, and then to prepare the paper to be presented at Assembly, where the Assembly is going to take a decision on this long-term aspirational goal. And I mentioned the conference before. With that, I think that's it for me. Thank you. I don't know if you want to.
Thank you very much. No, just, well, next presentation will be addressing, in particular, CORSIA. Maybe, I don't know if there is any quick question or comment before going to the next. The one will be explain a bit more detail how CORSIA works. But just on the high level, meeting outcomes or long-term aspirational goals, if there is any question in the room.
There is a question.
Oh, yeah.
Hello, my name is Marta Marques. I work in the Transport Department in ANAC. And I want to address a question to Ms. Blondin, who stressed the role of CAEP.
Yes.
My question is, does CAEP will continue to develop its work if LTAG is adopted? How do you see its new role or new task? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good question. So CAPE is a committee of the council. So when you look at the structure of ICAO, you have the assembly, you have the council, and the council, so the 36 member states of ICAO that are permanently in ICAO Montreal, they have different kind of groups that helps them, technical groups that helps them to take decision. CAPE is one of them. It's the group on environment. CAPE has been developed in 1982, so it's a very long-standing group. And the format of CAPE is composed of different working groups that deal with specific subject. So you have working group on aviation emission, you have working group on operational measure, working group on sustainable aviation fuel, Cesar was part of that. And so you have this different working group. Every 3 years, so we have the assembly, and then we have the priority for the next 3 years. So depending on the priority, depending on what the state decide which priority are, CAPE can change a little bit the format, and we can create new group or stop group that are not necessarily pertinent anymore, let's say. So the group that developed the LTAG report, that has been, so the work has been done, and they will continue to work a little bit because work is not over yet. But then the mandate of the group can be adapted to answer to the need of the state. So depending on what the state decide at the assembly, depending on what are the next priority, the entire structure of CAPE, or the structure of CAPE, can be amended to some extent, because of course we keep emission, we keep noise, we keep operation, so there are groups that do not change. But the mandate of each specific group can be amended to match with the priority that are given by the state. And when I look at the state, I look at Tanya because, yeah, you are the state, so depending on what the state decide, then priority change.
I'm not the state.
No.
That is not.
but that's
we
the.
represent the state.
Voilà,
Yes.
yeah, that's why I was looking at you. Sorry.
Maybe I was to complement very briefly, Blandine, on that, because I mentioned before that this long-term aspirational goal discussion is a very transversal and fundamental discussion that will affect how we fly and the aviation business in the next 30 years. So one of the aspects that impacts is standards. It's not only like environmental recommendations, etc. It's really developing new standards. And for example, Blandine just mentioned, I had the honor to co-chair one of the technical groups on sustainable aviation fuels, and we have developed in the framework of ICAO a full sustainability framework, and there are new types of fuels being added to that framework. So it's a permanent evolving technical work that always need to be updated, and those standards are constantly being updated. That's why it affects not just environment, it really affects the whole aviation system, and it's a permanent activity to be updated also.
And if
Thank you.
Exactly, and if you look currently, we have 2 state letters that have been sent to state, where we invite state to take decision on the 2 standards that we have. So Annex 16. So the way it works, well, we have the Chicago Convention, and then you have annexes. For environment, it's Annex 16, and we have different volumes. So volume 1 on emission, noise, sorry. Then we have the emissions, and volume 4 for CORSIA. And we sent recently 2 state letters to ask state for their views on this standard, because we are changing the standard. And this is something that is done with the support of CAPE, because we have the expertise from the CAPE. And then the council take a decision, and then we ask the state for their view. So the state are really included in this process of review of standard. That's something I wanted to highlight. And yes, the standard are updated on a regular basis. Does it answer the question? Yeah?
I have a question. Also, taking into consideration the issue that Marta raised and your highlights, could you please elaborate for all of the people that are following us remotely, and all of our colleagues in the civil aviation industry and the civil aviation authorities, what you said earlier, that CAPE has around 100 and 200 people.
600 in total, yeah. More than 2 million.
And you explained that CAPE has subgroups that elaborate on different topics, and that those topics are going to be addressed on changing or improving the standards. Could you please give some examples of concrete subgroups? So we have LTAG subgroup that has developed the issue, and that has developed the declaration, and that has supported the high-level meeting that ended last week. Could you elaborate a little bit further on what are the subgroups and the specific topics that CAPE is dealing with, and that they are, so that all the attendees can perceive that it relates to operations and to standards and to airworthiness, and it has a close link that needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I wish I would have access to internet so I could show you the current structure of CAPE. So I don't know if we can. Maybe I can. I don't know if someone is in. Can I share my screen? Or I don't know how it works. But because that would be the easiest way if I could show you.
Not sure if you can, but
Is there?
in the break we will.
Maybe in the break I will try to show you and have access to internet, because the way we work at ICAO is everything is available on the ICAO website. So I know it may be not so easy to find, and I can I can understand that, but all the information is available publicly. That's really something that is important for ICAO. So CAPE, the term of reference of CAPE, the current structure of CAPE, the different subjects addressed by CAPE, this is all available on the ICAO website, public website. So we have working groups in CAPE, as you mentioned. We have working groups in CAPE that do not change, because we have subjects that are that remain since we have been working on environment. And ICAO has been working on environment since the late 60s, so there are subjects that are still valid now. So we have working group 1, for example, that deals with aviation emission. So they are the one when revising Annex 16 volume, aviation emissions, volume 2. Sorry, I'm getting lost with my volume in the working group. So they are the one revising Annex 16 volume 2 and to make it up to date. So I don't know how many revision Annex 16s have been through already, but each time we have revision, this is coming from CAPE. So this working group is also in charge of assessing database. It's also in charge of looking at guidance and all the document. So it's really, it's very crucial group. So we have one, working group 1, aviation emission. Working group 2, it's operation and airport and operation. So everything related to airport improvement, green airport, operational measures. So for example, we have done a review of the airport planning manual of part 2. This is only about airport, and where we have included green airports. So this has been done by this working group 2. So working group 1 on aviation emission, working group 2 on operation and airport. Working group 3, if I'm not mistaken, is noise. And they are dealing with Annex 16 Volume 1 and all the document and guidance and tools that ICAO is developing on noise. So these are this main, I would say the three main working group. Then you have one on CORSIA, you have one on sustainable aviation fuel, you have task force on specific subject. We have also a group of experts, independent expert, and they are doing this kind of independent expert review on NOx, on noise, on specific subject. So we have working groups that remain throughout the years, and we have this task force that are created specifically to address some specific subject. So I will show you at the break, if I can show you the current structure of CAPE, because as I said, structure evolve depending on what is decided at the assembly. Then we are going, we have the priorities for the next reunion, and the CAPE structure change to adapt and to reply to the mandate that we receive at the assembly.
Maybe also just to complement that, I think what is very important also to understand is that body develops standards, yes. But then those standards need to be applied and implemented, and there are also recommended practices that are not implemented by only just the environmental departments or environmental authorities. Some of them are. CORSIA, for example, is the case. It's jointly implemented by the civil aviation and the environmental authorities, but the standards, they need to be applied, the manufacturers. So in the case of European Union is EASA, but non-European Union countries, the civil aviation authorities need to implement those standards. Operations departments, airports, so it affects many different areas of the civil aviation organizations, the implementation of those standards developed by CAPE. Just wanted to highlight that.
And thank you. And that's why people in CAPE are not necessarily experts from the Civil Aviation Authority, state-nominated expert to work in specific working group. So you can, a state, Portugal, could decide to nominate expert from university, from fuel producer, from manufacturers, to be in this working group and to provide the expertise. So we don't have necessarily people from the Civil Aviation Authority. We have the people from the state that have an expertise to bring to the table on a specific subject. And I think that's important because we do have representatives from civil society, so NGOs. We have representative of NGOs. We have representative of aircraft manufacturers. We have representative from airlines, and expert from the state, and expert, as I said, from university, from the fuel, from different different stakeholders that are working on aviation and environment.
Thank you. It was very useful. Thank you. Thank you. So, Cesar, I think the floor is yours now regarding CORSIA.
We will again share the presentation. CORSIA is really, again, a topic that it's developed in the framework of ICAO. It needs to be implemented by all member states. ECAC is supporting our European member states' implementation of CORSIA. So what we will, with this presentation, basically we want to give a general overview on how CORSIA works. Many of participants in this event are not familiar with CORSIA, so we will need to speed up a little bit to get to the time. The last part of the panel today about the timeframes is only one slide, so both will be together in this presentation. Mm-hmm. So at this point, Blandine will start and we will be sharing the presentation among us.
Before we start, is there any question from online? The online, the remote? No, there is none?
Not yet.
Okay, perfect. And then I will ask another question. Are you all familiar with CORSIA? Can you raise your hand if you are familiar with CORSIA? Yeah, thank you. that I knew. Okay. So CORSIA was CORSIA is one of the category of measure that has been recently approved. It was approved in 2016, as I said before, and it is an agreement that we are very happy to have this agreement, and we had to have this agreement in 2016 by ICAO, and to have this agreement from the state reiterated in 2019. So discussion will be then now in 2022. We'll see how it's going to work, but that's a very important agreement that we had. So it was adopted by the Assembly of Resolutions 39, and it's the first global market-based measure for any sector. And the idea with CORSIA is to achieve the aspirational goals that were set in 2010, the two aspirational goals that I showed you in my previous slide, to reach carbon neutral growth from 2020. And this is to show that CORSIA is a complementary measure. That means we need to achieve carbon neutral growth from 2020 onwards with operational improvement, aircraft technology, sustainable aviation fuel, and if we cannot, then CORSIA come into play. And that's why we have CORSIA now, but CORSIA could be, at one point, the assembly, the state, could decide to stop CORSIA because we are reaching our objectives with this three category of measure. So what is important to highlight here about CORSIA is that the idea of CORSIA is to have a global solution, to avoid to have a patchwork of regional market-based measure, and I want to highlight here, and especially in Portugal, in the EU state, it's to avoid to have this regional market-based measure scheme, to have one global solution for all international aviation. I know we will be talking about that a little bit later, but I think that's something I want to highlight. And all the points that you see on this slide will be addressed in the upcoming slides. Just checking. So what did we develop for CORSIA, and what are the elements necessary to implement CORSIA? So as you see on the screen, we have an assembly resolution that explains what is CORSIA and what is the objective with CORSIA. You have Annex 16, Volume 4. That's the SOPs. That's the ICAO standard and recommended practice. So this is how to implement CORSIA and what is mandatory to implement in CORSIA. And CORSIA has two aspects. You have the MRV side of CORSIA and you have the offsetting side of CORSIA. And this is something that we will discuss a little bit later. And you have the MRV that is applicable to all states that have international aviation. And you have the offsetting part of CORSIA that is so far only on voluntary basis. Then you have ICAO Doc 9501, sorry, that's the environmental technical manual. And this is provide information on how to implement CORSIA. So this is like a guidance for the state on how to implement a CORSIA. And as part of the CORSIA implementation package, you have the implementation element. So we have 14 documents that are approved by the Council. And once they are approved by the Council, they are publicly available and posted on the website. That talks about the emissions unit, the list of CORSIA verification body, the list of states that are part of the offsetting requirement. So all the information, all the package of CORSIA is available on the ICAO website, and it's composed of the 4 elements that you see in front of you: Assembly Resolution, Annex 16, Volume 4, the ATM Volume 4, and the CORSIA implementation element. I think that's what I wanted to highlight here.
I will continue. I will very much reiterate a message just shared by Blandine, that is, CORSIA is the first global carbon offsetting system applied to any industry sector. So it's the first time a global sector agrees on establishing a carbon offsetting scheme. Now it's has been also discussed and will be applied also to maritime sector. Aviation was the first. So we were front runners, and as we've mentioned before about the work of CAEP and the standards, is a key example of CAEP develops a standard by request of the Assembly and by request of the Council. It is approved, and now the big challenge is that it needs to be applied equally and standardized at global level. That was a huge challenge because it affects operations. It will need to establish standards to monitor and report all the operational data. That's why if it goes beyond environment, it really affects operations. It will affect, for example, it develops a standard on fuels. We will talk a lot about fuels, so it also affects how fuels will be produced in the future. The energy sector is also affected by CORSIA, just to highlight that very important challenge of CORSIA. So what we will be seeing today also is that this new standard, Annex 16 Volume 4, establishes in different paragraphs, and here is highlighted the key design elements of this system, okay? And also how it is implemented, mainly monitoring, reporting, and verification. So just to highlight the key design elements, the first one, very important, is what CORSIA, it's what we call a phased implementation scheme. It is implemented in different phases to give flexibility to different states depending on the level of maturity and development of the aviation system to join the offsetting requirements, okay? Very important is that from the beginning, the beginning of 2019, all ICAO member states are expected and requested to monitor and report the emissions. So the CORSIA scheme applies to all. It's not voluntary. That is really to the whole ICAO member states are expected to do the monitoring, reporting, and verification. But the offsetting obligation, offsetting implies paying, we will explain it, but implies a cost to the operators to offset those emissions, will only be based on the voluntary participation of member states in the different phases. So the first pilot phase that started in January this year and is 3 years, 2021 to 23, is called the pilot phase. It will be followed by the first phase the next 3 years. And then after 2027, it starts what is called the second phase, that all member states are expected to participate. It's not voluntary anymore. But in that second phase, there are some exemptions. So basically, the least developing countries, also the landlocked developing countries, the small island developing countries are exempted. They can volunteer still to participate, but there are some exemptions, and then some technical criteria where, depending on the traffic, the countries with very little traffic can be exempted. Just to be clear that what is the voluntary participation is each state. The voluntary is not on the operators. It's on each member state volunteers to join the system, and then in that case the offsetting obligation applies. Okay, all member states are encouraged to participate, and up to now, as Blandine has also highlighted before, in 2021 already 88 states volunteered, but you can see that next year that will increase to 107 states who have volunteered to participate, and just in a couple of years, in 2023, 115 states out of 189 states have volunteered to participate, and that covers a huge percentage of the air traffic worldwide. We will see it. Very important design element that Blandine will explain as well is the route-based approach.
Thank you. We try to share. So he's talking on behalf of ICAO. It's fine. It's fine.
I talk on behalf of ECAC, but we have the same objective.
So that's one of the elements of CORSIA that is quite important to understand. And this is, and you see on that slide the MRV requirement, so the monitoring and verification requirement that are applicable to all. That's the gray line, and the offsetting. That's the green dotted line. Okay. So what you see between the four states on the screen, the green one are the one that decided and announced their participation in CORSIA. That's the case of Portugal. So Portugal is one of the green states. And you have other states, such as State C, that did not announce yet their participation in CORSIA. So as you can see, all the flights to and from the different states, they need all the flights. They are subject to the MRV. This is listed in Annex 16, Volume 4, and is applicable to all the states. The offsetting part, on the other hand, it's only between the states that are announced their participation in CORSIA, such as state A and B, or B and D. The flight between B and C, as you see, they are not subject to offsetting requirement. Is that clear for everybody? Because this is really important element to understand for CORSIA. CORSIA, it's two aspects, the MRV side and the offsetting side. So then, what's going to happen if a state C decides to participate in CORSIA? Don't read the answer, just try to guess. Tell me, what's going to happen if state C decides to participate in CORSIA?
Gets green.
Thank you. It does, exactly. And so all the flights, then all the routes between the green state and the new state C, or the green state C, then they will be subjected as well to offsetting requirement. That's what's going to change for this specific situation.
Maybe very important to highlight that is route-based. So all operations on that route, regardless of where the airline is from, has the same requirements. So in the same route between two countries participating in CORSIA, the offsetting obligation applies to all operations between those countries. It's independent on whether the airline is from the country, from other country, from third countries. So there's no distortion of competition between operations in the same route. Very important, I think, element to highlight.
Is that clear? Yeah. So that's what we have seen. So can covered and not covered change over time? Without looking at my slide, just with the previous one, yes, it can. So every year, a state can decide to join CORSIA if they have not done so by the 30 June. So every year, that's why we have now more states for 2023. We had 8 new states that decided to join CORSIA before the 30 June 2022 for the next year, 2023. So the voluntary, I'm talking here about the participation offsetting, of course, because as we have seen, MRV is mandatory for all the airlines flying between the states that are part of, of all the airlines flying internationally. Should I repeat that, or it's clear? No, it's okay? Okay.
You have answered this one.
Does the state not participate of any requirement? Well, no, you did actually, yeah. So what's happening if we have an operator who is going to fly between two green states, and they do not, and they are the operator from state C, for example, so the gray state. So this is operator from the state, the gray state, and they are flying between two green states. What's happening to this operator? Well, this operator will have the same. Oh, is that this one? Sorry, yeah. That's the one. No, I'm reading.
That's the one you
yeah,
replied.
exactly. This one I replied, and this one is the one. Sorry, I was a little bit ahead of that. And then this one, then what the operator will have still to comply with the offsetting requirement, even though his state is not in CORSIA, even though the state is not in green, then the operator flying between A and B will have some offsetting requirement, in addition to the MRV, because MRV is applicable to all. Remember that. Huh? In all the routes. So if you take that one, okay, back to this one. So what I was saying is, like, I am an operator from state C and I'm flying between A and B. Well, I will have to monitor my emission, obviously, because I am an international flight. And in addition, if I'm flying between A and B, I will have, in addition to that, I will have to offset my emission. Okay, MRV is applicable to all international flight, offsetting only between the routes between two states that are part of CORSIA.
So very important comment on that. Every member state needs to implement the monitoring, reporting, and verification provisions of this standard, regardless of whether they are participating voluntarily or not. Why? Because if you have an operator from state C that is not participating on the offsetting obligation, one operator from state C is flying between A and B, that operator will need to offset their emissions. So it will need to report to the state, and the state will need to apply the offsetting obligations to that operator, even if the state is not voluntarily participating. So that's why it's very important that all states are obliged to implement CORSIA, regardless of whether they are voluntarily participating or not.
Yes, it's not linked to offsetting at all. Huh? Mm-hmm. All states need to have a system, implementing a system and report the CO2 emission to ICAO using the CCR. This is regardless of the offsetting. Mm-hmm. Regardless if you're flying between two states or not two states, it can be only flying from states that do not participate in CORSIA, yet your state needs to report the CO2 emission to ICAO, because this is for the amount of CO2 emission that have been produced for international flight. And we need to have this global information. Okay? Please.
Yes, sure. So that would mean that there could be states that they have, of course, MRV implemented, but they do not communicate any flights because their operators do not fly between third countries. That could happen.
No. We can have states that are state C. We can have state C, and state C will report all the CO2 emission from the international flight, even if they're flying to other state Cs.
Even between B and C.
They are reporting all the international flight. It's not offsetting. The offsetting is going to be, that's why I wanted to come back on this one.
Comment,
yeah, because when you look at this graph, all the international flight should be reported to ICAO. CO2 emission from all international flight if they are above certain threshold and so on. Exactly.
Huh? What is the state? Can you, on a general way, how is it working with the states that do not belong to CORSIA on the offsetting part, but they have to comply with the MRV?
MRV, they do.
So how is they are doing? So
they are doing.
It's happening.
Yes, it's happening. Yes. So because we have now 108 states that I think that are part of CORSIA for this year, or 17. So all the state now, I think we have amount of reply from the state that is quite high. So I don't know exactly where we stand for this region yet. I can have a look and tell you. But what we have seen for the previous years is that most of the states, except the one that are in war or that are in a complicated situation, most of the states, they do report the CO2 emission to IQ, regardless if they are part of offsetting or not. This is really a different part of CORSIA.
Yes.
The MRV is really mandatory.
Yeah.
And the states are doing it, yeah. They have regulation in place, and they have this EMP in place, and they do work on that. Yes. Do you have any question on this slide? Because all the on this one, any question, any doubt? No. Because that's a crucial graph to understand how CORSIA works. And I think we have done that one. If a state will, no, we didn't do this one. That is, it's also maybe linked to your question. If we have a state that do not have any airlines, and if they want to participate in CORSIA, so yes, and we have invited those states, I have to say, to participate in CORSIA, because this will have zero impact on their for the offsetting, because they don't have any airlines. But all the foreign airlines who are going to fly to this state coming from a green or CORSIA state, well, then those flights will be included in the offsetting requirement. So yes, we have strongly invited, I have to say, the state that do not have aeroplane operator to participate in CORSIA. So that's clear for everybody, right? So if you're a small island state, or if you're even a landlocked state, but I will take Mali, for example. Mali doesn't have any airline and flying internationally. They have only domestic airlines. But Mali is part of CORSIA, because all the flights coming from Europe to Mali, well, then they will be part of this offsetting requirement. Okay.
Let's see. Here, so another very important element to understand is how CORSIA works in terms of offsetting. So the approach for CORSIA is based on comparing the total CO2 emissions for a specific year after 2021. So we mentioned before we have the pilot phase, first phase, and second phase. So after 2021, we will be comparing each year the emissions against what we call a baseline level of CO2 emissions, which is defined as an average of the CO2 emissions from international aviation covered by CORSIA. So for that average baseline, we only take into account the participant states. So it's recalculated every year. And then every year after 2021, it will be compared with that baseline, and the difference is what will need to be offset globally, okay? And we will explain now how this is happened. But just to graphically understand the offsetting, this graphic, in fact, it would represent a world without COVID, where in 2021, the emissions from aviation, and in 2022 would have grown from the previous year, so there would be always a part to offset. The reality today is that as COVID impacted so highly the aviation sector globally, we might not be in this scenario, but it's just to graphically highlight how it should be working in the future. Hope it is understood. Also, the CORSIA baseline emissions, as we refer to, and here we talk about the sectorial baseline, which is defined as the average total CO2 emissions for the years 2019 and 2020 on the routes covered by CORSIA in a given year. Okay, we also need to highlight that this was impacted also by COVID, and because the emissions in 2020 dropped so drastically, the ICAO Council took the decision to use the emissions of 2019 temporarily. Okay, so but that's just a temporary decision. but it should be the baseline should be the average between 2019 and 2020 as stated in the standard. Okay, so how does the offsetting works? Basically, the operators will need to purchase and cancel. We will explain what is this, emission units, what we call emission units. Maybe to more graphically explain it, is like credits from CO2 emissions, like 1 unit of CO2 emissions, it's equivalent to 1 ton of CO2 emissions that are reduced elsewhere. There are different sources of emission reductions. For example, projects can be deforestation, can be energy projects that are specifically fulfilling a number of requirements that are also defined in the CORSIA standard. If those projects fulfill those requirements, they can be eligible to generate emission units, and those units will be sold in the global carbon markets. So it's very similar to what is already existing in the carbon markets. There is a, you may know, like the ETS or the voluntary markets, there is a market on those offsetting units. And then canceling means that there is a permanent removal for each emission unit. It's like a banking system. Operators will need to pay with those emission units their offsetting obligations. Just to explain how it works. Also important, how the CORSIA offsetting requirements will be calculated. Very important that this is a role of the member state. The state, the Civil Aviation Authority or the competent authority will need to calculate the offsetting requirement for each aeroplane operator. How it is calculated? It is calculated multiplying the total operator's annual emissions, which are reported to the authority, but what we call a growth factor, and that generates the CO2 offsetting requirements. Okay, so in fact, the growth factor in a given year, it will be estimated as the percentage increase in the amount of emissions with respect to the baseline. We refer that the baseline is the average between 2019 and 2020. That will be calculated every year by ICAO. Why every year? Because it's always the average 2019 and 2020 from the traffic of member states participating voluntarily. So it can be different every year. So it will, this growth factor is calculated by ICAO, is given to the authorities, and then the authorities will need to multiply by the operator annual emissions. Okay, just to make give a brief overview on how it works. And then the growth factor, as I'm saying, it needs to be recalculated.
And that's why, to complement what you were saying before, when airlines flying that belongs to a state that is not CORSIA, right? This state, even if they did not decide to join CORSIA, they will have to calculate the offsetting requirement for their airline if they are flying between 2 green states. Okay, I'm state C, I'm gray. My airline is flying between A and B. I will have to be the one calculating the offsetting requirement for my airline when they're flying between 2 green states. Okay, so I am doing the MRV, I'm gray state, I'm doing the MRV, and I will do this work as well because my airline is flying between 2 green states. Okay, that's clear.
Mm-hmm. MRV is monitoring, reporting, and verification.
Yes.
We are very used to use, but maybe some of our audience is not familiar. We will talk definitely about it. Also, the CORSIA offsetting requirements are based. Well, it's kind of there was a kind of complex agreement when CORSIA was approved. Mainly, it will be based until 2030. It will be based on the sectorial growth of the aviation system. So the growth factor is not calculated individually, how an airline emissions have grown in 1 year with respect to the baseline. The growth factor is how the total international aviation emissions have grown with respect to the baseline. That it will be calculated, that's what we call sectorial, 100% sectorial growth until 2030, okay? But then after 2030, it's a combination of the global growth of emissions from the aviation sector with the individual growth of each operator. So it will, after 2030, it will be a transition towards more responsibility of the individual operator emissions growth, okay, in the calculation of that factor. This is just to, well, in the next, still 10 years will be calculated this way, but just for you to know that it's part of the key design elements of CORSIA. So one question that is raised, can an aeroplane operator's CO2 offsetting requirement be negative? Weird question. Why is this question raised? It could happen, and for example, this year, where because of COVID, the growth has been very little. What happens if, we will see in the next slide, that one possibility also of reducing the offsetting obligations is through the use of CORSIA, what we call CORSIA eligible fuels. That includes, for example, sustainable aviation fuels. So if an operator uses sustainable aviation fuels, or what we will also refer as lower carbon aviation fuels, they can reduce their offsetting obligations. So even if you had zero growth and then you use sustainable aviation fuels, theoretically you could have negative emissions. You could, in a single year as an operator, you could accumulate those negative potential emissions in the whole 3 year. The reporting period is in 3 years. You could sum up, but not beyond those 3 years. So in the 3 years overall offsetting obligation period, you would not have like you cannot have negative emissions. Yes, Arthur.
Let me interrupt. Just to say, there are already some airline operators assisting. Even in the afternoon, this will be tackled again. But even so, maybe it's important to explain that the compliance cycle is 3 years for MRV CORSIA, and within these 3 years, you can carry your negative offsetting. I guess it was in your slide, but you can take it to the next compliance cycle.
Exactly. That's what you see on exactly. You see, so it's not the MRV, it's just the offsetting. MRV is every year. Offsetting compliance cycle is 3 years, and you see that and you see that on the slide now, where you see what you see on the slide is the requirement, the offsetting requirement for 2021, 2022, 2023, and then at the end of 2023, airlines will provide the information. Then in April 2024 to the state will assess that and then report to IQ, and they will have to prove that they have been cancelling the emissions to the same amount of the offsetting requirement that the state provide them. Yes, and it's every 3 years, exactly.
Exactly, important.
Yeah, and you see that the cycle on the screen. Yeah.
And in fact, this slide, what it represents, that blue part of the graphic represents the use of CORSIA eligible fuels, including, as I mentioned, sustainable aviation fuel. So part of your offsetting obligations as an operator can be reduced by the use of those fuels, okay? And then you see that the authority in every 3 year cycle, you will need to sum up which are the offsetting obligations, but resting the part that is reduced by use of sustainable aviation fuels or CORSIA eligible fuels. That is a mechanism to incentivize the use of sustainable aviation fuels in civil aviation. It will have an economic benefit for the operators when they use CORSIA eligible fuels. Okay. Maybe Blandine, you wish to comment also on specific conditions for new entrants, new operators.
Do you have any question on the offsetting requirements? Sorry, I'm back to the previous slide, because this is an important mechanism to understand. You have the MRV, you have the offsetting requirement. Is that clear for everybody? Sure.
I'm from my question is regarding the sectoral calculation.
Yes.
So there is no route constraint regarding for instance, from country A to country B or to country A to country C. So there is no restriction regarding the route that was flown, only the total sectoral increment.
Yes. So, if I understood your question, yes. So the way we are going to calculate this gross factor, we are going to use the data that are going to be provided by the state through the MRV side of CORSIA. So all the data that the state will provide us through the CCR, that's the information that you're going to provide. You already provided to the ANAC Portugal. So that's all the CO2 emission from all the international routes that TAP has been flying. You send this data to your state, and then your state aggregate the information and send that to ICAO. So we have a global view on what's happening to all the states. And with this information globally, then we are able to develop this growth factor. And this is what César was, when César was talking about the sectoral growth factor, it's because we are taking the information globally for all the aviation sector. We don't take specifically the growth of TAP. That's your question?
That will occur in 2013, in 10%, but there is no correlation between the specific route from one country to another. It's just the total
it's
aviation.
A total, yes. We take the entire the global amount of information provided by all the states.
But considering all the routes that are participating in the offsetting. So there's a relation with the routes, but it's an aggregated calculation. It's not route by route. ICAO will take into consideration all the emissions from all the routes included in the offsetting obligations.
So when your state, for example, is going to upload information now, they are going to upload all the information from all the airlines in Portugal. And then they will have a view of the information. They will have the total amount of CO2, and they will have the total of amount of CO2 to be offsetted. That's going to be provided by the CCR directly. They will see which route are covered by the offsetting requirement automatically with the CCR. So this is something that we provide to the state. So they will see directly the amount of CO2 flown generated by the international routes, and then they will have the information on the amount of CO2 that are subjected to offsetting requirement. And then later on this year, ICAO will provide information, the gross factor, that to the state, so the state will be able to take the information, the annual emission from the operator for the CORSIA route, multiply that by the gross factor, and the state will give you your amount of offsetting requirement. That's going to be happening now, in October.
I think we will.
May I ask you to elaborate following your question on 2030, because 2030 is almost there. What will change in that period concerning
So
the growth factor?
we are going to take, thank you, good question. We are going to take then in consideration as well how the airline is performing. So if that's going to give the possibility for airlines to, how can I say that, to, if an airline, for example, is buying new aircraft and is very efficient, then this is going to be reflected as well in the amount of CO2 emission generated, because you will have less CO2 emission. So we will get this information as well, and we'll take this information into account when you calculate the offsetting requirements. So with this inclusion of the individual gross factor, we are taking, with individual share, we are taking as well the advantages, the benefits that the airlines also get because it's more efficient. So we are getting more closer to what's the reality of this specific airline. Mm-hmm. But there is one thing you need to know about CORSIA. CORSIA go through periodical review. So every 3 years, CORSIA has been revised by the Council and then by the Assembly, and we have major review where we decide if the scheme continues or not. And this kind of element can be part of the review. So there are things that are set now, but can be changed because state wants to do things a little bit differently. So there are things that right now, that's how it's going to work. I don't think it's going to change, but we respect what our member state wants to do. And as part of the review, this is also something that state can decide on. So that's what has been a plan. and we'll see if it's going to be the case in 2030. So I know it's
Yeah.
next to the corner, but it's also something that can be changed depending on what the state wants. Yeah,
may
sure,
add?
please.
I would just take the floor just to say that how important it is for us to have some feedback from the operators so that we as representatives in ICAO also can contribute
Yep.
according to what is felt by the industry, namely as the best solution possible.
Yep.
That's the way we all can contribute, and that's one of the reasons we are doing this workshop. So that's
And it's a very good element. You know, when we have been talking with the state and ask them, well, for the offsetting requirement, you need to talk if you want to join CORSIA for the pilot phase or the first phase. Talk to the airline as well. Talk to your airline, because they will be the one impacted as well. So you need to have this communication, and I think this initiative is great. You need to have this interaction with your airline, with your stakeholder, to get information on what is the best for them and what is best for your state. So.
I think we can try to wrap up, Blandine,
Oh,
because
sorry.
we're a bit late. But as you are
Yeah.
talking on the revision
On the
period, I
review?
think you have just
Okay.
mentioned this. But
So
eventually-
as you can see, we have this periodic review of CORSIA, the scheme of CORSIA as it is defined. So we are now under the first review, and we are going to talk about baseline. We are going to talk about a lot of different elements, and CAPE, to reply to one of the questions, CAPE has been also developing some proposal for the Council, and this proposal are going to be reviewed by the Assembly on the review of the scheme. And you see that we have this review cycle every 3 years with one special review in 2032. So there are things that might change, might be adapted on the scheme, depending on what the state also wants to do with CORSIA. And as we said, the special review is to check if we still need CORSIA after 2035, because right now CORSIA goes up to 2035. And we need to check if we are reaching the goals that we have been set in 2010. If we don't reach the goal with the three category of measures, so aircraft technology, operational improvement, and sustainable aviation fuel. So if we reach our goal in 2035, and then we don't need CORSIA anymore, then CORSIA could disappear. But that's going to be a decision of the state. And if it's not, we don't reach the goal, then CORSIA will continue, and CORSIA can be more stringent in the future, clearly.
I think also the main objective of this presentation was to understand the different roles, and this last slide shows how CORSIA cycle works and the different roles of the aeroplane operator, the state, ICAO, and we will talk this afternoon also on the role of verifiers and verification bodies. So it's just to highlight those different roles that Tanya is also mentioning, the important feedback from the operators.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that slide complements very well your intervention, and you see this interaction between the operator and the state, and this open communication that is needed, because indeed you need to have this exchange of information both ways. With your operator, and then the state is the one providing the information to ICAO on the CCR. Yeah. You want to go to the next quickly?
Maybe we just conclude with explaining also the timelines. This is just the last two slides to highlight that the timing on reporting is linked with the different phases. We have just mentioned that during 2019 and 2020, already the operators and the states needed to report to ICAO the CO2 emissions to be able to calculate the baseline. And then after 2021, aeroplane operators need to report to the state. Also the verification bodies, we will talk this afternoon about the role of verification. And then every year after 2021, the CO2 emissions data need to be reported, of course. And then after 2021, also optionally, CORSIA eligible fuels need to be reported if they are started to be using. We will talk this afternoon as well on the new regulations at the European level on using SAF, so that will affect also the reporting. And finally, Blandine also mentioned before that the first cancellation of emissions will not start until 2025, because the pilot phase, it will be a 3 years compliance period that will be reported in 2024. So the first offset, the first cancellation will be 2025. Just to maybe to conclude, Blandine will comment. This was shared before, but the main deadlines for this year, 2022, especially this afternoon for the operators, but also the authority.
So next deadline is for the state to submit the 2021 CO2 emission data aggregated, to ICAO. And then the next deadline for ICAO is going to be to publish the 2021 CO2 emission. The 2020 CO2 emission is already available on the public website. And at one point, I would like very much to show you the website to show you where to find information. So I will check it during the break how I could show you that. And we will publish the 2021 sector cross factor. That's going to be used by the state to calculate the offsetting requirement for each operator. We will be receiving from the state the list of operator, as well as the list of verification body. This is a requirement every year to the state. Oh my, okay, myself. And we will be publishing the list of operator and verification body then on our website. I think that's what I wanted to highlight here. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
So thank you, Blandine. Are there any questions? On Teams? And how do I assess the questions? Please?
If I may,
Yes?
Carlos from ANAC, Civil Aviation Authority, Portuguese. A warm use to Blandine and Cesar, special. My question is about offsetting requirements, and namely how to proceed from state point of view if, for instance, airline does not comply with the requirements.
Muito obrigada.
De nada.
I'm trying. So, Carlos, very good question. This is something that the state needs to address with the regulation. So, at the beginning, you will recall when we started CORSIA, states were invited to implement CORSIA regulation and to include CORSIA in the national regulation. So, this is something that how can I say that? Should be included in your regulation. So it's going to give you the means as a state to go back to the operator and tell them that they did not comply with their requirement. It's on the state responsibility to make sure that their airline are complying with the CORSIA requirement. Having said that, we have seen a lot of support from the airlines and the airline industry for CORSIA because CORSIA is global. So airlines, a lot of states did not develop regulation yet, and yet airlines are providing data, yet airlines are really complying with CORSIA globally, and we can really see that we have this support from the airlines industry because they see also the interest of having one global system to address CO2 emission from the aviation industry. But to reply to your question specifically, it's the state that needs to develop regulation and to make sure that their airlines are complying with CORSIA.
Very clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have another question, sorry.
Yes, sure. Sorry, I was trying to.
Miguel Costa from Galp. I'm going to do the question the other way around. What is the advantage of a airline to go negative on their numbers? We see that there can be a law stating that they must comply, but what is the advantage of complying more than they have to?
When you say complying more, what do you mean?
It's the question of going negative on their baseline, I would say.
You mean but going
complying more than they should.
So you're buying more. Well, you can do that for a year. So you can go negative. Let's say for the year 2022, and you can take this negative number to 2023. But then you cannot go over the compliance cycle. So you can go negative. I'm really doing like that. So you can offset more than what you need to. You can buy more credits, and, for one specific year, and you can use this deficit for another year within the compliance cycle. But you cannot take this negative or deficit to another compliance cycle. So the compliance cycle is going to stop in 2023, so you can bring that up to 2023, but then it's going to disappear. So I would not necessarily recommend that you buy too many credits, because you cannot use them then for another compliance cycle.
So that would be considered a giveaway, basically.
Yeah, well, you can do that too, yeah, it's true. and yeah, but it's, sorry, you want to say something, but yes, just within a compliance cycle.
It's more a theoretical than a real world scenario, but the main way that you could go negative is by using CORSIA eligible fuels. So that would add like a negative over your emission obligations. So the offsetting obligations cannot be negative. If you have not grown with respect to the baseline, you will be zero. It will not be negative. But it can become negative, as we say, in a year basis by the use of CORSIA eligible fuels. It's more theoretical than practical. Obviously, the operators will need to establish their strategy on the use of SAF or CORSIA eligible fuels to optimize that. But for example, in the European Union, there's going to be an obligation already of a 2% after 2025, we will see. So that will come into the equation of the financing departments of the operators. But frankly, it's more theoretical than that real world.
Yeah. Or if you buy offset credit, if you buy emissions unit, but if you buy more than what you need to, then you can gain, I mean, so your state is going to give you an amount of offsetting requirement in October. If you have, let's say, 100, and you're buying 150, you can use this remaining 50 units for next year. But you cannot carry on these 50 units after the compliance cycle. Okay? I mean, that's important. Otherwise, that's, as you said, it's a giveaway.
May I share?
It's a gift to nature.
May I share?
Oh, sorry, sure.
From one agent to the other, I'm from high-fly operator to the fuel supplier. I think it's just a question of image. And because going negative, no one will want to overspend money being so expensive and so hard to get as well. I think just a question of image, really.
Yes.
And we're still on a long road to get there, to get affordable, very easy to get SAF fuel. So I think that's just that.
Yes, that's a good point. So, for example, many operators, many corporate clients of operators are requesting already operators to use SAF, as you say, for their green policies and their own corporate policies and voluntary schemes. So that can drive the use of SAF beyond the requirements, but it will, let's say, account as the sometimes corporate policies, etc. So that's another element that will be happening very soon and very often.
Are there any more questions?
Just a quick comment. I know we must go to the break.
Yes.
But I guess this...
Artur Sousa from Portuguese CAA, and I'm also Portuguese K-pop server member. I would ask Blandine just to elaborate in a minute, because we talk all morning about CO2, but there's pretty much behind CO2 tackling, and I guess ICAO's work and companies' work is also about non-CO2 emissions, and how this is tackled with LTAG, for instance, and with CORSIA, because we tend to write CO2 emissions, but there are benefits beyond CO2. So can you elaborate in a minute, please?
Sure. Thank you for the question. So yes, indeed, a lot of the activities and initiatives undertaken by ICAO have benefits on other sectors, not only necessarily on CO2 emission, but other emission. But the mandate of CORSIA, though, is on CO2. the objective with CORSIA is really to reduce CO2 emission, and what we ask the state to report to us is this amount of CO2 emission from the airline. So, good question. In 1 minute, it's you know, it's because we are addressing a lot of. So maybe we go for the break, and then we can address this question, because it's a long very interesting question with a lot of information behind. Yes. So, but CORSIA, very short. Yes, we work on other domain, other aspect. When I was talking about KP before, I talk about the independent expert review. We have that on NOx. We have that kind of review and work done by ICAO on other aspect of emissions, so not necessarily CO2. CORSIA, though, is mostly on CO2 emission. But yes, ICAO is working a lot on other aspects, and noise is one as well, one component as well. And when you look at the state action plan, and this is also because state action plan, as I said, it's an overarching policy. State action plan is everything that you're doing in your state to reduce CO2 emission. But one aspect of the state action plan is also the co-benefits. And co-benefits is all the action that you're taking within your state that have also benefits in other domain. So not necessarily on CO2, on international CO2 emission, but on other domain that you want to showcase. So, well, trying to be very brief here, but it's, most of the work that we do right now visible is CO2. A lot of work is still done on other aspects, and when we talk about the state action plan, we can talk a little bit about that. Yes, thank you. Good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Blandine.
Thank you.
So, since we are running a little bit late on our schedule, I would invite you all present here to a coffee break, and the ones attending remotely, we will resume in 10 minutes' time. Thank you.
Thank you.
A very short break. So, good afternoon, everybody. We're back with the second part of our workshop. We will resume our presentations for Mrs. Blandine Ferrier and Mr. César Velarde. So I would invite Mr. César Velarde to give us some insight on capacity building programs. César, the floor is yours. Thank you.
That's it. I will very briefly just give an overview on, we have mentioned before that long-term aspirational goals, as well as CORSIA, all these new environmental policies developed by ICAO and supported by European states need a lot of capacity building to implement those measures. So the European Civil Aviation Conference established prioritized capacity building for environment after what we call the 2016 Bratislava Declaration. In 2016, all ECAC member states committed to implement CORSIA from the pilot phase. So in 2021, a new capacity building program for environment was created. My position was created in the ECAC Secretariat, and this program has three overall objectives. The first one is to support all our member states' efforts in fulfilling the ICAO policy and regulations, as we've been talking before about CORSIA. Strengthening, this is also very important, strengthening the competences and knowledge of people dealing with environmental matters in our member states. And here I highlight, when we refer to strengthening competences, and this is an example, this workshop, of people dealing with environmental matters, is not necessarily people from the authority working on the environmental departments. I mean, most of you in the different departments of the Civil Aviation Authority are dealing with environmental issues, even you are not working on environmental matters. We've mentioned before operations, for example. There are a lot of things affecting operations. Air traffic management is highly affected by environmental policies. So this is an example I just highlight. Our capacity building is addressed to all civil aviation staffs that need to deal with these kind of issues, and then promoting and supporting information as we are doing today. Okay, so this new position was created. One of our objectives is also to promote partnerships between different states. So this is an example. You have, I think the audience today, you have a privileged position, Portugal, and all your Portuguese-speaking civil aviation community. You have a privileged position to, I would say, reinforce, because you already have a partnership among you, so to reinforce environmental cooperation through those partnerships. So also our capacity building is aimed to promote those kind of bilateral and multilateral partnerships. Supporting, Blandine will refer to Act CORSIA, Act SAF, different ICAO initiatives on capacity building. Our intention is to support also that. And also we will refer to Act CORSIA, Blandine will refer. So we are here also to support our member states joining these kind of partnerships, okay? Also highlight very briefly that CORSIA also established the possibility of administrative partnerships, which means that two or several member states can get to bilateral or multilateral agreement to share the implementation of the administration of CORSIA. So, and for example, in your community that you share a language, that could be a possibility. Some of your member states could agree to make a common management of the administration of CORSIA at member states. This is a possibility just for you to consider, and anything you would need if there is an interest on that we could support. Just want to highlight that. For example, another capacity building activity we are doing, and some of you are participating, is we do at ECAC monthly environmental webinars. Once per month we do a 1-hour webinar. It's very short, but addresses different environmental topics, and it's open to everyone who is willing to participate from civil aviation authorities. And we can, if a civil aviation authority like Portugal suggests us to invite people from third countries, they are welcome. Just for you to know, this information is also at ECAC website. And well, this is the list of different topics that we have addressed just to highlight. And we are doing other activities like supporting state action plans that we will talk now, CORSIA workshops. We have created a specific sustainable aviation fuels task group that is developing guidance, etc. I will conclude here, not for the sake of time, but just for you to know that there is a full capacity building program from ECAC, as there is as well in ICAO, and I will pass the floor to Blandine, who now will summarize the capacity building activities of ICAO. So Blandine, the floor is yours, and I guess your presentation will be on the screen soon. Thank you.
And yes, thank you. And before the presentation arrives, yes, and one thing that we are trying, working in two different organizations, also to work together as we do today. So to really try to have a better support for member state and working together in a more coordinated manner. I think that's something we are very happy to do.
There must be a presentation. You will see a presentation material
it's
from
2.1.
ICAO capacity building activities.
Yeah.
That's
the one. Thank you. So mine is very quick and as well because I mean it's thing that we have seen already. So and the way ICAO is providing support, we have this kind of support that we do today. So participating in a workshop, providing tailored support to state, but as well we try to develop a program or I would say initiatives where we bring state together. And that's why I like very much the group, and I don't know how to pronounce it, this group, because you are working with other states and you are supporting each other to move toward the right direction, I would say. And this is really something I've been lucky to be part of one of the meeting and to talk about environment in this group, and I can really see the interaction between the state, and that for me was, it's very good. I think it's really, really good. Something to be encouraged. And it's what we do actually with IQ. We try to create these kind of partnerships between state that have already developed or implemented or moved on environment, on CORSIA, on that action plan, on sustainable aviation fuel, and to bring all the partners together. That's really something we try to do as one of the initiatives for capacity building. So we have seen about CORSIA. So what an important element about CORSIA is the MRV. We have seen that in the previous slide. But some states, they were not able to implement this MRV properly. And for some states it was complicated, challenging. They didn't know how to do. How do I implement an MRV? And they had no, it was more complicated for them maybe to get this information on how to implement the MRV. And some states are part of CAPE, such as Portugal. So states like that are already in CAPE, they get information, they are more sensitized to environment. Some states are not. They're not part of CAPE, so they have less information. So with this Act CORSIA that we developed, and you can see on the screen, it was developed in 2018, approved by the Council, was to have a coordinated approach to make sure that when we provide support to a state, all the states get the same information, and everything is coherent, and states that have already more information on CORSIA can support state to implement CORSIA. That's the idea behind Act CORSIA. So CORSIA is this big umbrella, I would say, capacity building activity where you have different elements. You have these buddy partnerships that César was mentioning in a few slides before, where you have one state that have already implemented CORSIA that support other state to implement CORSIA. But you have also seminars, you have online tutorial. That's why I want to show you the ICAO website on CORSIA, because there you have a lot of information on CORSIA. Just the FAQ webpage is amazing about CORSIA, and it's something that when you start to implement CORSIA, if there is one element to look at, that's this FAQ webpage. It's very, very practical. We develop brochure, leaflet, videos, of course, and you have the support as well of the regional office, such as me, for CORSIA. So this is for CORSIA. Here you just see some of the picture of the different event that we have organized, where we have also trainers that have been trained by ICAO, and they are providing the same training to all the states. So we ensure that all the states get the same information on CORSIA implementation. This is the current list of buddy partnerships under CORSIA. So as you can see in blue on the green on the right-hand side, you have the state that provide support, and in white, the state that are receiving support. We are now in the phase 3 of CORSIA. As I said, it started in 2018. Now phase 3 is about the use of CORSIA Central Registry. It's about this providing information to ICAO, and then we will continue with the offsetting requirement. We have also the use of CORSIA eligible fuel. I didn't mention it. So these are the phase of Act CORSIA. And the way it's developed is each phase corresponds to the requirement that the state need to implement for CORSIA. This is the CORSIA website that I would like to show you in real. So you can see that all this information is available to everybody. The Assembly Resolution I mentioned before, the SARPs, Annex 16 Volume 4, the Environmental Technical Manual, all the CORSIA implementation element, all of this is available on the ICAO public website. And under Act CORSIA, you have the frequently asked question webpage that is very useful to implement CORSIA. So this is part of Act CORSIA initiative. We have seen that before. We have also new material on the CCR that I wanted to highlight today, and this dedicated web page on the CCR. So this is more for the state, but state focal point, because normally I use this for state focal point, I invite you to look at this web page. You cannot access this web page directly from the website. You need to type it, and to type the link, and then you have access to the CCR material, and it's for focal point. So this is one page that is quite relevant on the use of the CCR. We have also the ICAO Buddy Partnership, the ICAO Buddy Program, and the way you are working with CACL. This one is.
By the end of the day,
I will be able to say it. Yeah. And what you're doing with the CACL, that's really good, because we have you really have this support from, at the period when I was doing this training, from Portugal and from Brazil. So the state that were in this group, they were beneficiating from Brazil, from Portugal, to get information on how to develop an action plan. So this is, it's really something that we try to encourage within this program. This is just to show some of the states that have been part of this program. There is also one that we have been developing recently, is the ACT-SAF on sustainable aviation fuel. So we have published some feasibility study that we got from with the money that we got from the UNDP project. We got some fund and we developed feasibility study to support state to develop sustainable aviation fuel. And more recently, as I said, launched 1st of June 2022, it's the ACT-SAF program, where state organizations are invited so far to share their intention to participate on ACT-SAF. And how it's going to work, as you can see on the screen, what we want is to, so right now we are collecting the information on the state and organization interested on SAF, and the idea behind then is to coordinate the interaction with all the participant, state or stakeholder, with the possibility to support feasibility study, to train state that would need that, to provide support for the implementation of policies, to support for the memorandum of understanding to be signed between parties. So this idea is really to connect all participants, state, industry, relevant stakeholder all together, and to try to support the development and deployment of sustainable aviation fuel. So, and that's what I mentioned, that regional offices of IQ as well provide support, capacity building, tailored as such as this participation here or the one in the calc before. And we try to work with more and more with regional organizations such as ICAC, ACAO, IAC. So IAC is the Interstate Aviation Committee for the Eastern European state, to provide support to the state of the region. So that's what I wanted to highlight today. And one thing is very important, there are a lot of information on the IQ public website. I will show you after the break where to get this information. It's very important to have access to that. That was short and sweet, right?
Yes.
Perfect.
Perfect. Thank you, Nadine.
Thank you.
Cesar. And for the last item for our program for this morning, we should have an overview on the state's action plan. So a presentation from your side and a very quick and small presentation from ours, just to highlight what's being done regarding state action plan. So Cesar Blandin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
It's presentation 2.2, please.
So again, in this presentation, we will give a joint overview of state action plans. But in this case, Blandin will give an initial introduction on what is a state action plan, as it is an ICAO initiative, what is the background of that. And then we have also developed at ECAC level guidance and recommendations, in which, by the way, Portugal was a key enabler of this guidance. There were a number of small group of European member states working on that, and our colleague Arthur was a contributor together with Anna and Portugal. So we will be also explaining what is the content of this guidance for the European member states, how to implement how to develop state action plans. Sorry, so that's going to be the content of our presentation. If you can share the presentation of the screen, 2.2 state action plans.
So I will start. The state action plan is, so we have been talking about different initiatives at ICAO. So we have been talking about CORSIA, we are talking about fuel, we are talking about technical improvement and so on. But all of these mitigation measures, they are mitigation measures to reduce CO2 emission from international aviation. And this mitigation measure, they can be showcased in what we call the state action plan. State action plan is an overarching activity. This is where the state put the information on what's happening within the state on aviation and environment. And this is where it's crucial that the state discuss with all the stakeholders. And when we talk about stakeholder, national stakeholder, we are talking about airlines, we are talking about airport, we are talking about air navigation service provider, about fuel producer, we are talking about industry. So all industry and university. So all of these stakeholders, aviation stakeholders, they need to be included in the state action plan process. Why? Because there are things that are happening in a different environment, in a different in your different area of expertise that the state authority does not necessarily know. And they need to have this communication to implement this kind of measure. And we have seen when we started this initiative in 2010, thank you. So we've seen that when we started this initiative in 2010, that very often state authority were not necessarily aware about the plan of their airlines, about the different operational measures that were implemented by the air navigation service provider, or the plan for the fleet renewal. So all these measures that needs to be included in a state action plan. So you have to keep in mind when we talk about this state action plan that it's the long-term strategy that the state want to implement in the future. It's not binding, it's voluntary. State showcase what's happening in their country and what is planning to happen in their country up to 2050. So it's an idea of where we want to go up to 2050. That's what is in the state action plan. Every 3 years, states are invited to update their plan and to submit them to ICAO. So it's a living document, and we will see this in detail. It's a living document, and it's a document that that needs to be updated to reflect the reality within your state. So you can have mitigation measure. You can be an airline, and you can think that you have for example, you're going to renew your fleet in 2022, in 2030. So you can include that in your state action plan. But if, when you're going to redo your action plan, to update your action plan, you realize that these mitigation measures won't be implemented, you just remove it. It's not binding. At this stage, as we are now, and I'm talking here before the assembly, as we are now, state action plan is a voluntary document, and it's a document that reflects what's happening in your country. There is no fixed target. It's just an idea, a projection of where we think we are going to be up to 2050. Things can change, and you can reflect the changes in your action plan. And one key element about the success of having this state action plan developed is to have this communication channel between the state authority and the stakeholder. That's what, if I can highlight that. So we have seen this slide already, talked about this 2010 aspirational goals that have been approved by the Assembly. And linked to this goal, state action plan, because with the state action plan, state could showcase how they were going to achieve those goals, and they could also monitor their own achievement through those goals. So we are talking about collective goal. So IQ take a look at the state action plan that are submitted by the state. We aggregate the information, and then we can report to the Assembly and say, yes, we are reaching those goals collectively. And state itself can use the state action plan to monitor also the progress toward the goal at their state level. So the state can look at the different mitigation measures, talk with the stakeholder, and then check if the state is progressing toward those goals. But we are talking here about collective goal. We are not talking about a state goal. So this is the situation that I showed you. We have 133 states that have developed an action plan. And one element I want to highlight here is that states are supposed to update their plan every 3 years. So you can see on the small graph on the side that's not necessarily the case, and some states would need to update their plan because some just develop one action plan and never update it. So we need to invite states to continue to update their plan, because an updated plan showcases the activities that have been undertaken in the state, and to reduce CO2 emission from international aviation. It's a document that showcases what's happening. Still mine? Yeah, okay. Because we shared the slide, I don't want to take his slide. So what is a state action plan? So it's a document, it's a tool that voluntary, and I mentioned that before, where a state communicates to ICAO all the information on their activity to reduce CO2 emission from international aviation. It's important, it's written here, and I already said it, but it's really important. It's a document that needs to be updated every 3 years to respect what's happening within your state. It should include national action, and it should include as well, or can include as well, activity implemented regionally. This is going to be further addressed by César. When we talk about national action, here is because it's a state action plan, so it should reflect what's happening in your state as well. So I know I know Portugal is part of ICAC, and ICAC has this common section, and we are going to talk about it. But what we want to invite as well here is also the state to include in their state action plan what they are doing, because there are things that are being done at the national level and should be reflected in the action plan. And I think the next is yours, right? Yes.
Well, basically just to conclude what is a state action plan, highlight is that is a very collaborative effort. This is something that needs to be done involving all the key stakeholders. It can only be developed involving not only the aviation authorities, but the environmental authorities. I know you're working together here in Portugal with, for example, statistics departments. It's very important to have the data, airlines, airports, air navigation service providers, fuel providers, etc. A very important element that we saw in Europe. Before, Blandine has just highlighted that it can be included in the state action plan, all the measures implemented nationally, but also regionally. And in Europe, there are many measures that were implemented at regional level. The best graphic example is air traffic management. So we have, and it's even beyond the European Union. That's why we decided to do it at ECAC level. We are working at Europe on a European single sky. As you know, we are developing very strong and making enormous investments on optimizing the airspace of Europe. So all ECAC member states have some measures that are implemented commonly that would be very difficult to quantify at national level. How much of the efficiency of the European single sky can be attributed to Portugal, Spain, France, or Romania? It's very difficult. But if we do that assessment at European level, then we can quantify. That's the reason why at ECAC, we decided to create a specific working group to develop this guidance material that I will very brief summarize. As I mentioned, there was a very reduced number of it was a small working group where Portugal played a key contribution to this work. So, and very important to highlight that these ECAC guidelines are fully compliant with the general overall ICAO guidance material for the implementation of a state action plan. So it's really a contribution at European level to this policy from ICAO that Blandine has just presented. The main purposes, especially of these European common guidelines for the European state action plans, is to highlight the efforts taken collectively at European level, defining what we call a common section that we invite to all the 44 ECAC member states to include in their state action plans, okay? And very important second element, we will see that the state action plans, you need to develop what ICAO defines as a baseline. You need to compare how your emissions, the measures that you are implemented at national level, will contribute to reduce the emissions attributed to your country with respect to a baseline. So we also saw that we could calculate with the traffic at European level a common European baseline, so we could compare the benefits of all those common measures with a European baseline. Okay? This is why we decided to develop this document. I will not go much into detail because we just wanted to give an overall overview on how these state action plans go, but we have different appendixes with those common section, there is a general common introduction, etc. Maybe, Blandine, you wish to comment on just this slide, which is the general minimum contents of a state action plan, because that's defined by ICAO guidelines.
Thank you. So exactly, thank you, Cesar. So what you see on the screen is basically what's supposed to be an action plan. What a minimum information needs to be in an action plan. We need first a focal point. What is a focal point? Is a person that has been nominated by the state to be the project manager of the development of the state action plan. And this is our main contact person. So normally it's someone that's been nominated by the Civil Aviation Authority. And so this person is going to be responsible to manage the development of the plan, discussing with the stakeholder, and make sure that the plan is then updated and then submitted to ICAO, because there is one way to submit an action plan to ICAO, is through the APA website, and this website is a dedicated website for the state action plan focal point. No one else. So if we want to receive this action plan from ICAO, from the state, and if the state wants to submit this action plan to ICAO, then it's through the APA website, and it's with a focal point, nominated focal point. So this is crucial. Then, what's the focal point will do? Focal point will develop with the National Action Plan team, with the stakeholder. They will develop what we call the baseline scenario. Baseline scenario is a situation in your country when there is no action taken to reduce CO2 emission from international aviation. So is that a situation with no action? So just a caveat here, baseline scenario in the action plan is nothing related to the baseline on CORSIA. Okay? CORSIA is one of the mitigation measures that can be selected in action plan. So action plan is overarching policy for all the international, for all the activity that your state is taking for international aviation. Okay? It's not the same thing. Then you, focal point, will talk with your national stakeholder and identify the list of mitigation measures. And as I said before, can be new operational measures implemented by your navigation service provider, can be a fleet renewal with your airline, or can be a reduction of weight, can be the use of GPUs instead of APUs, can be all these mitigation measures. And this is included in your list of mitigation measures. What you need to do as well is you need to quantify those measures. This is where, as well, you need to talk with your stakeholder, because they have the information on the amount of CO2 emission reduction that will be reduced from this measure. So how much I'm going to reduce if I switch my APU after 1 minute and use GPU? Let's take this example. How much I'm going to reduce if I'm using a solar panel to feed my gate? How I'm going to reduce if I have a fleet renewal and I'm changing 2 out of my 3 airplanes? So all this reduction, this quantified information needs to be included in your action plan. And then, you aggregate this information, and you're going to draw a line that's going to showcase what are the benefits. And when I talk about benefits, it's CO2 emission reduction. What are the benefits you're going to reach with this mitigation measure implemented in your state up to 2050? Okay? So when we are talking about this state action plan, that's why it's an overarching document that showcases policy actions implemented in your state. It's a long-term strategy and showcase and integrate all the activities. It's not, it's a very overarching document. So if your state, which is the case, is part of CORSIA, CORSIA is one of the mitigation measures to be included in your plan. It's one, but you have other mitigation measures, aircraft technology, operational measure, and so on. And then the last part of your action plan is if you need any assistance to implement mitigation measure or assistance that you may need for the state action plan. So basically that's it. That's a state action plan. You have the baseline scenario with, in blue, that's a situation when you don't take any action. In green, that's the list of mitigation measure, any measure that are implemented by your stakeholder. And in red, what are the expected results? What will be achieving when we are going to implement all these mitigation measures up to 2050. So basically, that's a state action plan. I think that's you.
I will go very fast through this because we will give the opportunity now to Ana to present a very practical example that is the Portuguese state action plan. But just to very briefly say that the structure and elements of a state action plan in line with what has just been presented by Blandine, we included in that guidance material a common introduction for all European states and different section addressing the measures taken collectively at European level, but we also invite all member states to include additional national measures in the state action plan. We will see it, so I will not go very much in detail. Again, highlight also, Blandine has just said that the baseline is one of the key elements of a state action plan, and just to highlight that we calculated this baseline, and this is updated again, every 3 years we update this guidance material to support all ECAC states. Just to highlight, this is how it looks, the ECAC baseline scenario calculated last year, and you will see here that the COVID-19 impact was obviously considered in the calculation of that scenario. The Appendix 3 of this guidance includes all this list of measures taken collectively in Europe. So you see there's a lot we are doing, mainly technology and standards, sustainable aviation fuels, etc. We will see it now with the Portuguese state action plan. And just to conclude, I pass again the floor to Blandine on the interactions between state action plans and LTAC.
Thank you very much. And I think this is a very important slide because we've been talking about LTAC before, and you see the link between the LTAC, long-term aspirational goals, sorry, and the action plan, and the work that has been done for this, all the work to develop the LTAC. So when we used the action plan that was submitted by the state to understand what are the potential reduction from different kind of mitigation measure, from operation, technology, and fuel. And so the state action plan were a source of information for the LTAC work. And as well, when you look at the LTAC report, as this can be a source of inspiration for new mitigation measure that you can implement in your state. And you can see that what we are trying here, and it's something maybe my message for this slide is to think out of the box and to see what's happening elsewhere. Still operation, technology, and fuel, but there are new technology, there are new kind of operation, and there are new fuel that could be explored when you develop your next state action plan. And I think that's it, right? Oh, well, that's what I said. And maybe one thing in more detail, you have the list of potential stakeholders that you could include in your discussion when you develop or you update your state action plan to see what's happening in the three areas I mentioned, so operation, technology, and fuel, and what could be their views, for example, what the university is doing, or you have maybe other company in Portugal that could be relevant to be included in the discussion for the update of the action plan. Thank you.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I just highlight that many of these state action plans are made public, either in the ICAO website globally, and at ECAC website we publish the state action plans from European member states who volunteer to publish. So there's a reference there also to look at what others are doing. Thank you very much, Ana.
Thank you, Blandine. Thank you, Cesar. So on our program, next is a small presentation regarding the state action plan from Portugal. So I would ask kindly if the presentation is uploaded. So while it's being uploaded, as Cesar and Blandine explained, we have here a common view on a state action plan and then an European view and guidelines on how to perceive and how to develop and elaborate a state action plan. So Portugal was a part of a team, as Cesar mentioned earlier. So Portugal was a part of the team that issued some guidance on some topics, on some inputs on how to develop a state action plan. The idea of the state action plan, while it's being uploaded, I will do as it did. It's already there. Well, I will do as Blandine did. Our state action plan has 4 specific items, 4 specific structures. The first one is an overview, The second one is an introduction regarding the current state of aviation in Portugal, where we highlighted traffic, air traffic controls, movement statistics, the Portuguese fleet of our airlines, and bilateral agreements that are put into place in order to find out exactly what kind of traffic that's being developed to and from Portugal. The third chapter of our state action plan relates to the measures taken collectively in Europe. So as Cesar explained, there are several measures that are broader. So we need to address those measures and to indicate those measures still in our state action plan, although those measures are more broad and more comprehensive. The fourth item, or the fourth chapter of our state action plan, relates to the specific measures that are being addressed by the Portuguese stakeholders, by the Portuguese industry, and they also relate, and this is specifically mentioned in our document, to the government strategy regarding decarbonization. So there's a link between the policies, the public policies that the government has issued on environment and on the goals of decarbonization, and the state action plan. So this is how this document is structured, and the document, as stated previously, is available on the ICAO and ECAC website. So, looking at the presentation, we will have a small introduction, and the idea here is not to go over the state action plan because it's 120 pages. It's to present to you the process overview. How did we manage to create this state action plan? How did we contact the stakeholders? What were the lessons learned? Because there were some difficulties and some things that didn't go quite as we expected. And what lessons have we learned, and how are we going to do things differently? Some highlights, and how are we going to do our future work? Because as Blandine has mentioned, and as Cesar has mentioned, the action plan must be updated. So we are now in the way of collecting and gathering all the data that we need and pursuing this goal of the update of the state action plan. Before going into depth in the presentation, we have an advantage. The Portuguese Civil Aviation Authority has a mandate from the Portuguese Statistics Authority. So all the statistical operations from the aviation sector are conducted by us. So we have firsthand all the statistics. We conduct the statistical operation, and then we give it to the statistical authority. So we can save some steps on the way of gathering data, and it's very important because it allows us to address the statistics and gather the statistics and the data as we feel fit for purpose. So this is a topic that I think should be highlighted. So regarding the state action plan, well, Portugal recognizes the value of each state preparing and submitting a state action plan. We do so because we are fully committed with the goals set out in the long-term aviation goal, and we need to have a common approach on a European vision, because, as mentioned before, since we have so many European projects, there should be a common approach at every European state in order to get information comparable to ICAO and to give a similar set of information, since we benefit from some of the same projects. So we submitted our first state aviation plan, state action plan, in 2012, and we have updated in 2021. So, as Blandine was saying, the state action plan is not a document set out by the Portuguese Civil Aviation Authority. It's a document that needs to gather information, statistical information, and information from all the other stakeholders and the relevant organizations on the value chain of aviation. We did so by addressing this topic with ECAC, with ICAO, and implementing obviously the guidelines set out by ECAC, but we approach all the stakeholders in order to get the information needed to put into place an updated state action plan. So, how was it done? Our state action plan, as I mentioned previously, replicates the guidance that was and the structure that was issued by ECAC. We have a common section, as I mentioned earlier, and we have a specific section regarding Portuguese projects. Once we were gathering information, we had a difficulty that was to ask our stakeholders to quantify the impact of the measures and the mitigating measures that they were telling us and that they were identifying. So I think that's probably, and this will be highlighted further on, probably our main difficulty is not to collect the data, we can collect the data, but it's to, with the stakeholders, to quantify exactly what are the benefits of that specific measure, because otherwise we will be having qualitative information but not quantitative information. And in order to address and to calculate an impact of a mitigation measure, we need to quantify it. And that, I think, is the most difficult and the most challenging part of structuring a state action plan. So, first of all, how did we do this and how we will do this? We started out by making a written consultation to our value chain. So, airline operators, ground handlings, non-government organizations, research and development institutions, universities, the Portuguese Environmental Agency, of course, and navigation service providers. All of the organization and the stakeholders that we feel had some valuable input to address the state action plan. Since at the time there was, we were expecting an implementation of the Refuel EU Aviation, and this was being discussed, we also contacted fuel suppliers in order to get some inputs on sustainable aviation fuel. So we did this on our present state action plan, and we will emphasize this on the update that's being prepared. Since there was the difficulty of quantification, as I was telling you about, there was sometimes the need for a second round of consultation in order to try to comprehend exactly what were the measures and try to assess even the stakeholders in order to give them some kind of methodology to quantify those measures or to approximately give them some kind of a proxy in order to make that information relevant in times of comparison. So, what were the lessons learned? First lesson learned, there's a difficulty on quantification of measures. Second lesson learned, when we were addressing stakeholders, sometimes the stakeholders' organizations change and people in the environmental bureaus, all of those organizations change. So we found out it would be most useful to give the stakeholder the information that they gave us for the latest state action plan and say, well, we are going to give you this written consultation. We need to get this information, but bear in mind, this is what you said earlier. These were the projects that you identified earlier. Because not in all of the stakeholders, but in several stakeholders, people were changing. Well, it's a wonderful thing that people change, but the knowledge should be kept in the bureau, and sometimes it was not. So we found out that giving the stakeholders the information that they gave us previously would help to identify what was being done, to, for instance, say, well, this project was not completed or finalized, we changed this one for another one, and that saves time, it's much more to the point, and we found it much more effective. So we are going to do this again. So what are the highlights that I would like to share with you? The Portuguese State Action Plan underlines both national contributions to European deliverables and new measures. We must point out that besides the legal obligations that our stakeholders have, there are some, and this is presented in the State Action Plan, there are some other projects that airlines and airports and air navigation service providers are addressing, for instance on SAF, or for promoting environmental awareness for passengers. So these measures were all highlighted and identified in our State Action Plan. So just to give you some examples, there are some projects within our State Action Plan regarding research and development in sustainable aviation fuels. So regarding a project on municipal waste derived CO2 into synthetic e-fuel on Oporto and others on other parts of the country. So there are some, they are not producing SAF on a huge scale, but there is some way moving forward on sustainable aviation fuel. And of course, we will get back to these projects on our update on the State Action Plan. Other highlights that we think that are important to be stressed here today is that our stakeholders have more of a social responsible approach and a social awareness regarding improving efficiency and environmental competitiveness. So I think that the carbon footprint management, the standardized operation practices, environmental management systems, and another set of examples that are set out in the State Action Plan should be addressed and will be, of course, followed on our update. So we, of course, on a small scale, because when compared to Europe, our traffic is it's not so much representative, but on our scale, we are making our way on raising awareness of corporate social responsibility towards climate change, and I think that's very, very important. So regarding the future work, so we will work with our stakeholders. We started collecting the data, statistical data. We are now on our way to develop a common framework in order to address and to ask for the identification of mitigation measures, and we will be contacting our stakeholders through, first of all, a written consultation, a second written consultation, and then workshops, meetings, in order to get a more comprehensive State Action Plan. So that's it from the Portuguese Civil Aviation Authority, and I don't know if there are any questions regarding State Action Plans for Blandine, Cesar, or myself. Yes, Carlos Gomes from Teams. How are you, Carlos?
I'm fine, thank you. Well, when I raised my hand was a question, but now after the two presentations, it's just a remark because it was very clear about the state of our action plan. My question, my remark, not a question, is about the new rule of action plans. because one of the main outcome of the high-level meeting was the new rule of the action plans, as Blandine said, to monitor the progress to achieve a long-term aspiration goal. I wonder about our rule to improve and increase our action plans within the relation with our stakeholders, how to improve, how to tell them that there is a new rule, a different rule as a contribute to achieve the long-term aspiration goal. This is my question: is the pragmatic steps that you have to take as a civil aviation authority?
Well, in spite of your question being addressed to the Civil Aviation Authority, I think that Blandine wants to jump in. So, Blandine, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Carlos, it's a very good question. I don't know if the mic is on you. It's a very good question. When I mentioned the role of the selection plan, I said before the assembly, because we don't know exactly yet if the role is going to change. There will be first discussion at the council and then discussion at the assembly. One proposal is indeed to have the selection plan as a tool to monitor the progress and for the long-term aspirational goal. But right now, the selection plan is already a communication tool, and this is a tool that we use to get the information from the state on what's happening in the state regarding the different mitigation measures that are implemented. It's not yet used to monitor the progress for the long-term aspirational goal. This is not decided yet. It was discussed at the high-level meeting, indeed, but it's one of the means that could be used to report this information. But it is, how can I say that? It's not decided officially that's going to be the case, yet state action plan, as it is now, it's a communication tool with what's happening in your state and what is information you want to send to IQ. That's the fact, that's what an action plan is. If it's going to be used officially as the official reporting tool to ICAO for the long-term aspirational goal, I don't know that yet. It was one proposal. It is still on the table. It might be, but we'll see after the assembly.
But as you know, it's very strong from third countries. For instance, the rule of the action plans.
And I'm very happy with that. I think it's great.
Yes,
It's a great tool.
Yeah,
I've been working on that action plan for years, so happy to have that. But as I said, we need to wait for the assembly first.
So complementing on Blandine for her intervention, I know that Cesar wants to jump in. Regarding the methodology that the Civil Aviation Authority is applying, since it's not being yet decided, but we feel that we should continue to do the work that has been done. For instance, consultation process first, giving the stakeholders the items that they have identified earlier in order to establish a comparison. So that our methodology is not very different on identifying what was done and trying to compare of what has been accomplished. Nevertheless, as Blandine just said, we will monitor and we will be, of course, in the assembly and comply with everything that's been decided. But that doesn't mean that the work is not in progress and that we will not continue to gather information and to put on information and organizing this information in order to have a document that reflects the state of play of Portugal on the state of action plan. So, Cesar, I think you want to jump in also?
Thank you, Ana and Carlos, for your question. What I wanted to complement is that clearly, we have seen before that the European position towards the Assembly is to ensure that there's going to be a strong monitoring system if there is an agreement on long-term aspirational goals. And in fact, one of the outcomes of the high-level meeting was requesting ICAO to propose methodologies. So regardless of whether the state action plan will be the tool or not, is a decision that has not been taken. What it is clear is that the state action plans is a successful initiative that only 10 years ago was just a new initiative. Very few member states started doing state action plans. Now it has become a worldwide, widely extended best practice implemented by an increasing number of ICAO member states. So there's a lot of lessons learned. Anna has just shared very useful lessons learned from your experience. I think regardless of which is the tool, clearly the experience of the implementation of the state action plans in the last 12 years since it was launched, it will be definitely a good reference on establishing how to look at the future and how to monitor any long-term aspiration goal. So I see a clear link regardless of the final decision. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's a very good message for us, but more for our stakeholders as well.
Do you have any other questions,
Thanks.
Carlos?
No, thank you, Anna. Thank you, Blandine, and thank you, Cesar.
Are there any questions? Yes, Vitor.
Yes. Hello, my name is Vitor Valagão. I work at the Portuguese CAA at the Aviation Safety Directorate. My question relates to the EPAS. The current version of the EPAS has a full chapter dedicated to environmental matters. And although it has only two specific action types, which are research actions and rulemaking tasks, a following edition of the EPAS may have a member state task. And if so, Portugal may choose to implement it or not. And if we choose to implement the member state task addressed in the further or the following edition of the EPAS, we have to implement it through a specific action plan. We have the equivalent national level of the EPAS, which is the State Plan for Aviation Safety. But now I know that we have a state action plan which deals with these matters. So my question is, if a following version of the EPAS has included a member state task, and if Portugal chooses to implement it, should we address it in the state plan aviation safety, or should we include it in the state action plan? Thank you.
Thank you for this very good question. And yeah, and I think this is going to be a question that we will receive more and more. The way I see it, and the way I see it is, you can get this information, and you will have your state safety. I forgot the name now of your plan. SSP. No. Yes, that's it. State plan for aviation safety. So you will have some information there, but you will need to work in collaboration with environment. So the way, and you can report the information, the same information in both plans. I think it makes sense and it's relevant. But that's exactly what we were talking about. It's talking to each other, talking with all the different parties within the Civil Aviation Authority, with your stakeholder, to understand what's happening in a different area. Because there are a lot of interaction between all the different bureaus and the different stakeholders that needs to be discussed first, to make everybody aware of the situation, and then to make sure that what you're going to report is going to be compatible with what's going to be in the action plan. So the way I see it, I would put in both, with reference in both documents, because it's a plan from for Portugal. From Portugal and for Portugal. So it's your plan, and it's the plan for Portugal. So it's just two sides of the coins, but you need to put the same information there and has to be compatible
and coherent
in the two plans. So I think communication channel is there. So that's the way I would recommend to do it. Thank you.
I would also like to add, I think you're highlighting a very good example where interdepartmental cooperation is needed, or dialogue. We are always highlighting that many of these environmental topics are not only addressed by the environmental departments, but there's also the other way around. There are many experience raised in other domains. We are seeing this in, for example, as capacity building expert at ECAC. We are learning a lot from previous capacity building activities in both safety, security, so methodologies, approaches, how those plans, for example, have been developed. Applying those lessons to applying the environmental policies, it's also a super positive experience. That's why this dialogue at national level is always very useful through multi-stakeholder, including different departments of the government bodies. You can really learn from each other's experience and then decide, again, as you were saying, your specific question, whether to place it in one plan, the other, or in both. But there are many lessons learned that can be shared.
Thank you, Cesar. Are there any further questions? So, well, we are ending the first part of our seminar today, so it's my job to highlight some closing remarks. First of all, to thank Blandine and Cesar. This capacity building proves to be very important, not only for the stakeholders, the industry, other authorities, but also as demonstrated now within our own organization. So it's important to have these kind of sessions in order to discuss these items and to have such clear presentations from Blandine and from Cesar. Just to wrap up in a very summarized way what we discussed this morning, we were explaining, Blandine was explaining the role of ICAO on capacity building as a way to achieve the vision for carbon neutrality. Long-term aviation goal is an important milestone for all of us in aviation and to get states committed to a common vision. We also discussed CAPE, and we also discussed how CAPE is an important element towards this vision. And we also discussed that the role of CAPE is not only to be addressed and not only to support people dealing primarily with environmental issues, because, as Blandine explained, CAPE also deals with noise, with standards, with technical issues. We've also learned that these elements regarding environment will relate an impact on SARPs and will relate an impact on operations, on airworthiness, on airports. So this will impact on all of the value chain of the aviation sector. So we should not be looking at the environment bodies. We should be looking at the value chain of the aviation sector, and we should put all the stakeholders working together and talking to each other in order to spread the knowledge, because this is very important, to know what is being done. So aviation is a world, so it's impossible to know what's being done everywhere at all times. But these capacity buildings, and to take the time to learn and to reflect upon those issues is very important, because we now live this, and I will for sure, knowing that this will have a huge impact on myself, on my job, and on this organization that is the Portuguese Civil Aviation Authority, but not only that, on the energy authority in Portugal, on universities, on airlines, air operators, air navigation service providers, and so on. So we've also learned, and we had some information, some very, very specific information on the timelines that are in place in order for us to achieve these goals, and on the work that has to be done for all of us to achieve these goals. We had some inputs on the challenges of CORSIA, on the key designs of the CORSIA elements, and on the phases of CORSIA implementation. So we also had information, very useful information on capacity building that's being developed by ICAO and ECAC in order to enable all the stakeholders to better implement this vision and to achieve these goals. So I will be very anxious for the second half of the program today, and I would like to thank Blandine once again and Cesar for this magnificent presentation, and to thank you all for being here, present today and remotely at home, and we will resume the workshop at 2:15. Well, it's supposed to be at 2 o'clock, but we are away of schedule, so 2:15 we will resume again. So thank you very much. See you in a bit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.